I'm Jessica, a 25-year-old woman, and I have an older sister, Emily, who is 29. We've never been particularly close, and much of that stems from how differently we've been treated by our family. Emily, being the eldest, always seemed to get the better treatment, whether it was intentional or not. For years, I tried convincing myself it was all in my head, but as I got older, it became clearer that she was the favored child, and I was left in her shadow. The favoritism was hard to ignore. No matter what Emily did, whether it was reckless or even downright harmful, she was given the benefit of the doubt. Meanwhile, I wasn't afforded that same luxury. She could break a rule or say something hurtful, and it was always excused. But if I so much as did something mildly out of line, I was immediately scolded. It was a bitter pill to swallow growing up, and it left me feeling insignificant, like no matter what I did, I'd never measure up. The dynamic in our family made it difficult for me to feel secure or appreciated, so as soon as I turned 18, I moved out. Putting physical distance between myself and the family seemed like the best way to protect my mental health. In some ways, it worked. I felt more at peace living on my own and focusing on my life. But that didn't erase all the damage. The resentment lingered. When I left, Emily wasted no time trying to turn my parents against me. She told them I was into drugs and alcohol, which was a complete lie. Yet my parents didn't even question her accusations. They believed her without hesitation, not even bothering to ask for my side. I offered to take a drug test, but they brushed it off. It hurt more than I can describe, knowing they'd rather trust Emily's words than give me the benefit of the doubt. That incident was the final straw for me. After that, I went out of contact with my parents for about 2 years. I didn't want anything to do with them, and for a while I was happier for it. Without their negativity, I could finally focus on myself, my career, my relationship with my boyfriend, and building a life that didn't revolve around their judgment. It was liberating. Then COVID hit, and everything changed. During the early months of lockdown, I still wasn't in contact with my parents, but news came that my dad had been hospitalized. Despite everything, I couldn't just sit by and ignore it. Even though they had hurt me, I couldn't bring myself to treat them the way they had treated me. I believed that regardless of how I had been treated, I should show up for them in their time of need. That's who I wanted to be, someone who treats others with kindness, even if it's not reciprocated. So I reached out to them, and we began to slowly rebuild our relationship. Things weren't perfect by any means, but it was a start. My sister, unsurprisingly, wasn't thrilled that I had re-entered the picture. I could tell she was waiting for me to slip up so she could swoop in and ruin everything again. But this time, I was prepared to stand my ground. When my parents started having financial issues, I decided to help them out. I know it sounds naive, especially considering everything they'd put me through, but I thought maybe if I stepped up where Emily failed, I'd finally earn their respect. I convinced myself that if I proved I was reliable, they'd start seeing me as an equal to Emily. Surprisingly, my plan worked, at least for a while. Every time Emily tried to stir up drama, my parents defended me. They openly acknowledged how she hadn't been there for them, and they appreciated how I was helping them out financially. But deep down, I knew their appreciation was tied to their dependence on me. They couldn't afford to upset me, or they'd lose the financial support I was providing. In a way, it gave me power, but it was a hollow victory. I didn't want to be valued just because of what I could give them. I wanted to be valued for who I was. Despite all this, I kept helping them. Part of me thought that if I just kept proving myself, maybe one day I'd finally be on equal footing with Emily. But it was becoming clear that this was more of a transactional relationship than a genuine reconciliation. As all this was unfolding, my personal life was finally on the right track. My boyfriend and I had been together for 4 years, and after our anniversary, he proposed. I said yes, and it felt like my life was finally falling into place. I had a decent relationship with my parents, a stable career, and now I was engaged to someone I loved deeply. Everything was coming together, except for the tension with Emily. Emily's reaction to my engagement was less than enthusiastic. She couldn't understand why I'd want to get married so young, especially when she wasn't married herself. But here's the thing, Emily had never had a stable relationship. Her relationships barely lasted a year, so her reasoning for why I shouldn't get married felt ridiculous. I chose to ignore her negativity and moved forward with planning the wedding. I even invited Emily and my parents to the wedding because, despite everything, I still wanted my family there on my big day. That leads me to the most heartbreaking moment of all. The wedding was last Saturday and my parents didn't show up. I didn't get a heads up, no message, nothing. I waited, hoping they were just running late. But then my maid of honor showed me a post Emily made on social media. She had hosted a lunch at her place on the same day as my wedding, and my parents had chosen to attend her lunch instead of coming to my wedding. Seeing them all together in that photo, smiling and happy, broke me. They didn't even bother to let me know they wouldn't be there. I had waited for them, believing they would show up, only to be humiliated by their absence. In that moment, I decided I was done. 7 years too late, but finally, I was cutting them off for good. After my wedding, it hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just the fact that they missed the biggest day of my life. It was the fact they chose to be with Emily yet again, as if my existence didn't matter. I had spent so much time hoping, wishing, and bending over backward for my parents' approval, only to be discarded for a casual lunch with my sister. That night, after the wedding was over and the guests had left, I made a decision. I couldn't keep doing this to myself, couldn't keep giving them chances to hurt me over and over again. As much as it stung, I knew what I had to do. I sat down with my phone and sent them a message, something I'd been avoiding for years. In the message, I laid it all out clearly. I told them that I no longer considered them my parents. I explained that I'd tried, time and time again, to be a good daughter, but they had repeatedly chosen Emily over me. I wasn't angry or emotional. I was just done. I told them that because they couldn't respect me or value me the way a parent should, I would no longer be part of their lives. It was as simple as that. I didn't expect much of a reaction, but almost immediately the messages started flooding in. They tried to excuse their behavior, saying they didn't mean to hurt me, that Emily's lunch was last minute and important to her. They asked me to understand that family sometimes has to make sacrifices for one another, but honestly, I had heard all of that before. I wasn't interested in their excuses anymore. This wasn't just about the wedding. This was about years of being treated as less than my sister. And I was done pretending that it didn't hurt me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty about standing up for myself. I wasn't willing to keep bending just to fit into their narrative. I'd spent too many years trying to make them love and appreciate me, and I wasn't willing to go down that road again. This time, I was determined to stand firm. In the weeks that followed, I ignored all their attempts to reach out. My phone buzzed with texts and calls from my parents, all filled with varying degrees of guilt-tripping, apologies, and excuses. My sister even chimed in, trying to smooth things over, but her messages only made things worse. She told me I was overreacting and that I needed to grow up. Apparently, I was the selfish one for not understanding how important her lunch had been. The nerve of her to make it sound like I should be grateful they chose her over me. That was the breaking point. I blocked them all. My parents, my sister, every single person who had ever made me feel small. The silence that followed was both a relief and a strange kind of emptiness. I wasn't sure what my life would feel like without their constant interference, but I knew it had to be better than what I had been living. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Part of me felt like a terrible person for cutting off my family. I had always been taught that family comes first, no matter what. But what happens when your family doesn't treat you with the same respect or love? Was I supposed to keep sacrificing my happiness for them just because we shared the same blood? That didn't seem right. My husband, David, was my rock during this time. He never pressured me to reconcile or made me feel like I was overreacting. Instead, he listened to me rant, cry, and process everything that had happened. He reminded me that it was okay to set boundaries, even with family, and that I didn't owe them my loyalty just because they were related to me. I had spent so long seeking their approval, but I didn't need it anymore. I had my own life, and it was time I lived it on my terms. David's support meant the world to me, but it also made me realize how unfairly I had been treated all my life. For years, I had been bending myself out of shape for people who didn't even care enough to show up for my wedding. Meanwhile, I had built a beautiful life with someone who loved me unconditionally. I had a career I was proud of, friends who valued me, and a husband who respected me. I didn't need my parents' validation anymore. I had my own happiness, and that was enough. Not long after the wedding, my parents hit me with another bombshell. They were struggling financially again. Apparently, Emily had failed to support them in any meaningful way, and now they were turning to me for help. Part of me wanted to laugh at the irony. After all the times they chose Emily over me, they were now coming to me because she couldn't deliver. I thought long and hard about how to respond. The old version of me would have jumped at the chance to help, thinking that maybe this was my opportunity to finally prove myself as the better daughter. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had spent years trying to win their approval, and it had gotten me nowhere. I wasn't going to fall back into that trap, so I didn't respond. I left their messages unread, refusing to engage. I knew what they wanted, a lifeline. They needed me, and for once, I was in the position of power, but I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. Emily predictably sent me a message, accusing me of abandoning the family when they needed me most. She said it was my duty as a daughter to help out our parents, but I saw right through her act. This wasn't about family loyalty. It was about her trying to shift the responsibility onto me because she couldn't handle it. I wasn't going to let her guilt me into fixing their problems. It wasn't my job. When I told David about the situation, he backed me up 100%. He reminded me that I wasn't obligated to sacrifice my happiness for people who had consistently treated me poorly. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it was the truth. I wasn't their emotional or financial punching bag anymore. The decision to cut them off was final. I wasn't going to change my mind, no matter how many times they tried to reach out. I had wasted enough of my life trying to please people who would never see me as an equal. I deserved better. I knew this choice would have lasting consequences. My relationship with my family was over, and there was no going back. But for the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from the weight of their expectations. Free from the constant comparison to Emily. And free from the feeling that I wasn't enough. Looking back, it was the hardest decision I had ever made, but it was also the best one. I had spent years living in the shadow of my family's favoritism, but now I was stepping into my own light. Things were quiet for a while after I cut my family off. It felt strange not hearing from them. No messages, no calls, no reminders of the pain they'd caused me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living with the constant pressure of their expectations weighing on me. It was liberating, but it also made me realize how deeply ingrained their influence had been. I had spent so much of my life trying to gain their approval, and now, without that goal, I had to figure out what I truly wanted for myself. David was my anchor during this time. Every time I doubted myself or felt guilty about cutting my parents off, he reminded me why I did it. He never let me second-guess the decision or fall back into old habits. He made me see that I wasn't responsible for fixing the mess my family had created. I had done enough, more than enough, to try and make things work, but they had chosen their path. Still, despite my resolve, my mother wasn't ready to let go. One day, out of the blue, she showed up at my apartment. I wasn't home at the time, but my neighbors told me she had been waiting outside for hours. When I got back, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave to avoid the inevitable confrontation, but another part of me knew it was time to face her. I opened the door, and the moment she stepped inside, it was like a storm hit. My mom didn't waste any time. She immediately launched into a tirade, accusing me of being selfish, ungrateful, and immature. She couldn't believe I had the nerve to cut them off, especially after everything they'd done for me. Her voice was sharp, and she was angry, angrier than I had ever seen her. But beneath that anger, I could sense something else. Desperation. She was desperate to regain control of the situation, to pull me back into the family dynamic where I played the role of the obedient daughter. But I wasn't that person anymore. I had spent too long bending to their will, and I wasn't going to let her guilt me back into that place. She kept going, ranting about how just because I was married now didn't mean I could turn my back on my family. She reminded me that I had responsibilities, that I couldn't just run off and pretend David was my only family now. "We're still your family," she said, "and you can't just erase us." I stayed calm, calmer than I thought I'd be in that situation. I let her talk, but when she paused for breath, I finally spoke. I told her the truth. I told her that I didn't feel like I was part of the family because they had never treated me like I was. Every time I had needed them, they weren't there for me. Every time I tried to prove myself, they ignored my efforts. And when it came down to the most important day of my life, they chose Emily again. How was I supposed to feel like they were my family when they had made it clear I wasn't a priority? My mom didn't want to hear it. She waved away my words, telling me I was overreacting and being dramatic. According to her, missing my wedding wasn't a big deal. It was just one day, and family should forgive and move on. But for me, it wasn't just about the wedding. It was about a lifetime of being second to my sister. I told her as much, but she didn't understand. Or maybe she didn't want to. She insisted that I was the one being unreasonable, that I was the one tearing the family apart. It was infuriating, listening to her twist the situation as if I were the villain in this story. But I wasn't going to let her manipulate me anymore. I had drawn my line, and I wasn't about to step back over it. When it became clear that the conversation was going nowhere, I told her to leave. I told her that if she couldn't accept that things had to change, there was no point in us talking. She called me crazy and said I was out of my mind for throwing away my family over something so trivial. But I stood firm. I wasn't going to keep playing this game. She stormed out after that, slamming the door behind her. But even as she left, I knew that this wasn't the end. My mom wasn't someone who gave up easily, and I had no doubt she'd be back, trying to mend things on her terms. But I had made my decision, and I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the mess of our family dynamics. After she left, I felt exhausted. It was one thing to cut them off over text, but facing her in person had been a different kind of emotional battle. Still, I knew it was the right thing to do. I couldn't keep letting them walk all over me, not if I wanted to live my life on my terms. In the days that followed, my father tried reaching out. He sent messages, trying to play the peacemaker, asking me to come to my senses and make up with my mom. But I ignored him. I didn't want to engage. It felt like they were all teaming up against me, trying to pressure me back into the fold without actually acknowledging what they had done. Emily, of course, wasn't far behind. She messaged me too, telling me to stop being so dramatic and grow up. According to her, the lunch had been important, and I should have understood that family sometimes has to make sacrifices. The irony was not lost on me. For years, I had been the one making sacrifices, always stepping aside for her, and now she had the audacity to tell me I should have done the same for her lunch. Her messages were as dismissive as ever. She couldn't comprehend why I was so upset and why missing my wedding was such a big deal to me. But that was just Emily. She never thought about anyone but herself, and I was done letting her control my emotions. David continued to support me through all of this. He reassured me that I wasn't in the wrong and that setting boundaries was healthy, even if it hurt in the short term. He reminded me that I had a right to protect my peace and to prioritize my well-being over people who didn't respect me. I clung to that thought as the weeks passed. My parents continued to reach out, trying different tactics to pull me back in, but I stayed strong. I knew they weren't going to change, not unless they were forced to face the reality of their actions. And I wasn't going to back down until they did. As hard as it was to distance myself from them, I started to feel lighter. The weight of their expectations, their constant disapproval, it was all fading. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living for myself, not for them. Of course, the guilt still lingered. There were moments when I wondered if I had made the right choice, if cutting them off was too extreme. But then I remembered the years of pain, the countless times they had chosen Emily over me, and I knew that I couldn't go back, not without losing myself in the process. This was my life now, one where I called the shots, where I chose who got to be part of my world. And as difficult as it was, I knew it was the right path. After cutting ties with my family, the silence that followed was both peaceful and unsettling. For the first time in my life, I wasn't bracing for the next confrontation or preparing myself for another round of emotional manipulation. It felt strange, not being constantly weighed down by the stress of their expectations, but it also gave me space to heal in ways I hadn't even realized I needed. As the weeks passed, I started to focus more on my life, my real life, the one I had built without their interference. David and I settled into our marriage, and I began to throw myself into work, hobbies, and friendships that had nothing to do with my family. It was refreshing to have that distance, to live without the constant need to prove myself to people who never truly saw me. But that didn't mean the guilt disappeared completely. There were moments, especially late at night, when I would wonder if I'd made the right decision. Cutting off my parents felt like a betrayal of the values I'd been raised with: loyalty, family first, sticking together no matter what. Even though I knew logically that those values hadn't been extended to me, it still felt like I was breaking some unspoken rule by choosing my own peace over family ties. David was always there in those moments of doubt, reminding me that I wasn't wrong for setting boundaries. He pointed out that I had tried over and over again to fix things with my parents, but they hadn't met me halfway. In fact, they hadn't even acknowledged the damage they'd caused. That truth kept me grounded. Still, the pressure from my family continued in different forms. My father in particular wouldn't let up. He sent emails and left voicemails, all variations of the same plea, that we were family and families forgive. He tried to appeal to my sense of duty, reminding me of everything they'd done for me growing up, as if those memories could erase years of neglect and favoritism. Each message was like a tug on an old wound, trying to pull me back into the toxic cycle I had escaped from. Emily, on the other hand, had taken a different approach. She wasn't apologetic, far from it. Instead, her messages were cold, dismissive, and laced with condescension. She told me I was being immature, that my decision to cut off the family was selfish and childish. In her eyes, I was the one causing the rift, and she refused to see her own role in the divide. But the more she tried to guilt me, the more resolved I became. I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the shadows, where my feelings and needs were always secondary to hers. For years, I had let Emily's needs take priority, and I was done playing that role. I knew, deep down, that I wasn't wrong for walking away. That didn't stop her from trying, though. The messages kept coming, but each one only reinforced what I already knew. I was better off without them. Emily's inability to see things from my perspective made it clear that she was never going to change. She had spent her entire life as the golden child, and in her mind, that role was never going to be challenged. As the months went on, I started to feel more at peace with my decision. The distance from my family allowed me to see things more clearly. I wasn't angry anymore, not really. The anger had slowly transformed into acceptance. I had accepted that my parents were never going to be the people I needed them to be, and Emily was never going to be the supportive sister I had longed for, and that was okay. I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. In the process of healing, I realized that I had been chasing something I was never going to get. I had spent so much of my life trying to prove myself to people who were never going to see me for who I was. Now, I didn't need that anymore. I had my own life, my own happiness, and that was enough. David and I grew closer during this time. Without the constant drama of my family hanging over us, we were able to focus more on each other and our future. We talked about our goals and dreams and what we wanted out of life together. It felt good to build something for ourselves without the weight of my family's dysfunction looming over us. My friendships flourished as well. I reconnected with people I had drifted away from during the years I spent obsessing over my family's approval. These were people who genuinely cared about me and who had always supported me without question. Spending time with them reminded me of what real, unconditional support looked like. It was the kind of support I'd been missing from my family for so long. One of the most unexpected things to come out of this journey was the sense of relief I felt in letting go. It wasn't just about cutting off my parents and Emily. It was about releasing the burden I had been carrying for years. I had been trying to fix something that was beyond repair, and in doing so, I had neglected my own happiness. Letting go of that need to fix things allowed me to focus on myself in ways I hadn't before. Over time, the guilt started to fade. It wasn't entirely gone, but it wasn't as heavy as it used to be. I knew that what I had done was necessary for my own mental health and well-being. I had spent years bending over backward to make my family happy, and it had never worked. Now, I was living for myself. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if things could ever be different, if my parents could ever truly change. But those moments didn't last long. The truth was, I had given them enough chances. I had tried to repair the relationship, and they hadn't met me halfway. It wasn't my responsibility to keep trying, especially when it was clear they weren't willing to do the same. As I moved forward with my life, I found myself feeling lighter, more at peace. The pain of being rejected by my family had been replaced by a quiet acceptance. I had learned that sometimes family isn't about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who love you unconditionally, and who respect your boundaries. David and I began planning for the future, talking about starting a family of our own. I wanted to create something different, something better than what I had grown up with. I knew that when the time came, I would be the kind of parent who showed up for my kids, who loved and supported them no matter what. I was determined to break the cycle. In the end, I didn't regret cutting off my family. It was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but it was also the most necessary. It had allowed me to heal, to grow, and to finally live my life on my own terms. I had spent so many years living in the shadow of my family's expectations, but now I was free. And for the first time in my life, I knew what it felt like to truly be at peace.